Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We proceed session number 3. The session title is E-Learning Systems and Tools. This session will be head and led by the chairman, Dr. Khalid Al-Saad, the Under-Secretary of Ministry of Higher Education in Kuwait. Dr. Khalid Al-Saad, he is currently the Under-Secretary of Ministry of Higher Education. He received his PhD in 1986 from Claremont Graduate University. He held several positions in and outside the academic field. Dr. Al-Saad was Dean of Business School in Kuwait, Under Secretary General of Kuwait, Under Executive Director of World Bank. He has published several papers in local and international academic journal. I will handle the floor to Dr. Khalid Saad to chair this session. تفضل دكتور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Thank you, Dr. Nader. The worst session is after lunch. It's always a siesta time after lunch. So we try to make it a lively session so you don't fall asleep here. We are delighted here to have excellent speakers in this afternoon session. The theme of the session is e-learning system and tools. We are delighted here to have Professor Tom Boyle. He is a director of the Learning Technology Research Institute at London Metropolitan University. Professor Boyle has published extensively on learning technology with a book. His latest book is Design for Multimedia Learning in 1997, and he has around 200 referred and invited papers. He led a team that developed learning objectives for programming that won a European Academic Software Award in 2004. He was a program chair of OER 10, Open Educational Resources, in 2010. On behalf of you, let's welcome Professor Boyle, and I leave it for you, Professor.
The sound is obviously working okay. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's been a very interesting event so far. It's actually quite interesting standing here because I realized that one of the themes of my talk actually is how the old and the new need to be blended together. And if you stand here looking down through this hall, which is in one sense very modern, but based on a very traditional architecture and idea, it's really quite an impressive blend. I'll start off I'm based in London, so I thought it might be nice to start off just with one slide of London. There's only one. We lived in the country before I moved to London, and I was rather worried about moving into a rather large city. And I was driving around, and I stopped at these gates and walked through, and this was the site I saw before me. And basically we've got sort of panorama of London with the city on the left and St. Paul's Cathedral in the centre. And I thought, well, it's not such a bad place to live after all. And about 30 minutes from that presentation is where the university is based. The university is on the Holloway Road. The Holloway Road was the old Great North Road from London to Edinburgh. It was the road which linked the whole country. And that little bit of road you see in the front there is part of the old Great North Road. And behind it, you've got a highly modern building. This was the graduate school in the university, which was designed by Daniel Libeskind. So again, we're getting this blending of old and new. So, why do we need it? What are the challenges? I've been in e-learning for a while now, and long enough to remember the microcomputer revolution of the 1980s and how that swept in, and for the first time people had computers on their own desks. And that was rapidly followed by a sort of multimedia revolution in the early 90s, when you could start using video really for the first time. Then you got the web sweeping in, which is revolutionary, and as that settles, you then get Web 2. which is not just reading anymore, but people contributing, active participants creating their own content. And this keeps going on, so you've got a rate of pace which... By the way, can you all hear me okay? If not, just let me know, okay. So the rate of pace is really changing, and what I'm concerned about is how do we design for that? So at the moment, mobile computing is coming in and has tremendous opportunities. But in 2 or 3 years' time, it'll be another wave, and 3 years beyond that, it'll be another wave. And the real challenge for us as educators is how do we deal with this? How do we build really effective educational and learning environments in this rapidly changing world? Okay, so basically, how do we adapt effectively to these changes? And how can we think about e-learning systems and tools, not just for the present, but also for the future, because the future is not very far away. So we've got learning in this period of really rapid, repeated change. And what's interesting is it changed both the goals of learning as well as the means. It's not just that we're learning the old things in a new way. New goals come in, and it's quite challenging to actually form an education system to meet these demands. And one perspective I find quite useful is that idea of ecology. So ecology is a sort of system, we live in a system. What the technology does is change our social and cultural and educational ecology. And what we have to be able to do is actually to adapt to that. And out of that, to actually foster learning that for our students is both appropriate for the 21st century, but is also effective. So the sort of themes of the talk are, first of all, I'd like to go fairly briefly over this quite major area, which is the impact of moving from closed to more open educational systems. Fritz covered this extremely well this morning, so I'll actually go through it relatively quickly, but the impact is potentially absolutely enormous. Then I'd like to look at pedagogically driven tools to transform education and learning. There's a lot of tools out there, but how many of them are actually driven by educational ideas, by pedagogical ideas? And that's something which is a challenge for us. And I'd like to look at those really across the different levels at which it impacts. At basic learning activities, at sort of session level, at course level. There are different layers at which we can actually impact. And my original discipline was psychology, so I'm really interested in the learning activity layer, because that's where the students actually experience learning. But they're incorporated into classes or lessons, they're incorporated into modules or courses, and we need to deal with all of those levels. But it's also interesting and challenging to look at new contexts for learning, and especially the widespread use and adaptation of new mobile devices. And that is transforming how we can use computing. Computing originally was something that sat in a room, huge big thing in a room that only a few people could access. Then microcomputers came along and everyone could have one on their desktop. Now with smartphones, everyone's going to have a computer everywhere they are. And that changes things quite profoundly. And it's both exciting and challenging. Okay, so I think Fritz covered this extremely well this morning, so I'll move over it more quickly and then we can look at some of the other issues a bit more depth. I think it's best summed up, the whole potential impact of open educational resources in the Cape Town Open Education Declaration. And it's worth reading out because they're very big claims. It says, we are on the cusp of a global revolution in teaching and learning. Educators worldwide are developing a vast pool of educational resources on the internet, open and free for all to use. These educators are creating a world where each and every person on earth can access and contribute to the sum of all human knowledge. Interestingly, they say they are also planting the seeds of a new pedagogy. So that really fundamentally transforms or potentially transforms how we go about education. And it has potentially big benefits but also substantial challenges. And I think Fritz this morning covered quite well some of the challenges for universities and educational institutions. How do they operate in this new environment? And the sort of double-edged impact for developing countries and like sub-Saharan Africa. The access to all these resources at one level is great, but to what extent are they appropriate, culturally appropriate and for their needs? And one of the things that interests me, which no one else seems to pay a lot of attention to, is how do you actually go about creating learning and teaching resources that are designed to be reused? What happens mostly is people develop it for their course, and then it gets pushed online. And it may not be appropriate. And you finish up, I think, with a lot of open educational resources which are of dubious value. And that throws up some of the issues and challenges below. One of them is quality. There are some very good resources out there, but there's a vast amount which it is quite difficult to actually reuse effectively. So you get overload. How do you retrieve and select the resources which are really good for you? So that becomes a problem. Even when you get a resource which is good, the issue of how do you embed it and integrate it into your courses for your students is still a significant problem. Tutors, teachers, lecturers aren't going to go away. They're going to become absolutely vital in actually being able to find these resources, shape them, integrate them for students. And of course, there's a key bit of cultural factors. And what that really means, I think, is open educational resources should be modifiable. So you should, if you find the resource which looks good but isn't quite suitable, you should be able to download it and modify it, adapt it to suit your needs. So I'd like to look now at some tools and resources following this sort of open educational thing to support different levels of what's sort of a formal education. And I've divided it sort of roughly into courses, sessions, learning activities. There's three sort of broad divisions. And I'm going to start at the bottom and look at some of the learning objects which are designed very much at this learning activity level. And that leads us quite nicely into, I'll take my examples mainly from the CETL for Reusable Learning Objects. CETL stands for Centre for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. And this was funded by the Higher Education Funding Council for England from 5 years, 2005 to 2010. It was quite a lot of funding. It was nearly £3.5 million. So it was a substantial investment. And the CETL did a number of things. The CETL, by the way, was a partnership with 3 universities. I was the director of the CETL at London Met, and the other 2 universities were Cambridge University and the University of Nottingham. It was quite an interesting mix. What I want to do is just selectively pick out some of the resources created. There were over 200 very rich multimedia learning objects created. They are all free for reuse. They can all be downloaded from the CETL website. But just to give an example, and all of these were developed by tutors, usually working with a multimedia developer. And how they developed them is something I want to come on to in a moment. So if we look at this one, what happened here was the tutor, well, I'll just go into the... Okay, go to here. We had a tutor in sports science, and what he was interested in was he wanted to teach his students about the biomechanics, what's actually happening here in terms of forces. So he worked with a multimedia developer, and what they did is, well, if you watch the arm here, while I move this slider, so if you just watch what happens to the arm. So you can actually see the muscle and how it's acting in the bone. And when I first saw this, it actually was quite informative for me because it actually made me realize something I hadn't done before. So what we're doing here is actually trying to create a rich resource which is using the media in a very powerful way. So it's something you can't get out of a book. And because he was interested in the sort of mechanics of it, this one here, you can actually look at the mechanics and you can play around. The key bit for force is the length of this line down here. When it's long like that, you've got a lot of force. And as it gets shorter, the force becomes less. Okay, I don't want to spend a lot of time on individual learning objects. Taking a different one, and one that's actually very generically reusable. This is for learning French, but it could be for learning any language. And what they did basically is they set up a, well, I'll just click it.
Bonjour Viviane, salut Audrey.
I think we need to turn the sound down a little bit. I'll try on my computer first of all. If I turn this down, that should hopefully help.
Et alors, comment ça va?
Ça va, et toi?
C'est quoi ce sourire?
Ouais, j'ai rencontré quelqu'un samedi dernier.
C'est génial.
Okay, so what they actually do is they listen to it. It's French, it could be any language. And then they answer these questions, either true or false. Okay? If they want to look at a transcript of what's happening, they can do that. So they can actually look at a transcript. So they can go back, and when they're finished, they can actually submit it, and they get an answer down here. Okay. But it's a little pattern, as you can see, can be used over and over again. And we produced a whole set of language learning. Okay.